So I don't think anyone here would argue with me if I said that I thought wooden boats are beautiful. Any arguments? Anyone's like, wooden boats are terrible? No? I didn't think so. So boats don't have to be wooden in order to be beautiful in my mind. This is my rules of maritime beauty. But I think there's something very special about wooden boats, right? I grew up in the Midwest, far from the ocean, but my dad is a hobby woodworker, and so I grew up with a real appreciation for the affordances of a beautiful piece of wood in the hands of a skilled craftsman. And I'd like to sort of talk today a little bit about wood and what wood means to us. Why do we like wooden boats? Why do we like wooden furniture? Why does wood have a special status? What does wood mean to us in the 21st century when we have so many different building materials available to us? You know, I think part of it is that wood signals a certain kind of quality. Craftsmanship as well. We know working with wood, maintaining wood products requires a real skill and expertise. Wood is a natural resource and a renewable resource in theory, but I think that in most places and in most times, human demand for wood outstrips the ability of slow-growing trees to produce it. So wood's also a little bit precious. And you know, I think these qualities of wood make it attractive, and those qualities are fairly consistent across time. But I think something happened to wood in the early 20th century. I think it took on a very special and particular cultural significance, and I think that we're still inheriting what wood came to mean about 100 years ago. You know, wooden furniture, wooden boats, and woodcut engravings were some of the cultural products where Americans thought through the meaning of work and the complicated relationship between labor and leisure in a technologizing world. So there was an energy transformation in the mid-19th century when organic sources like whale oil, tallow, wind gave way to fossil fuel use in a very big way for the first time. And I think that infrastructure also experienced a similar transformation in the 19th century. Wooden infrastructures like wooden sailing ships had largely been replaced by metal steamships. The iron horse of the railroad steam engine had already replaced wooden carriages, or started to, in the 19th century, and Henry Ford's Model T completed the transformation in the early 20th century. Print culture based on paper, a close cousin to wood, was being phased out by telegraph, radio, and film technology. There would always be wooden boats and wooden carriages in the world, but the everyday workhorse infrastructures that moved us and our culture through space and time were increasingly made of metal, plastic, and concrete. It was in this moment in the early 20th century when wooden objects and crafts took on a special meaning, and they came to stand for something that wasn't exactly modern anymore. So on the occasion of Herman Melville's 200th birthday, what a time to be in Nantucket, I would like to honor the great author by acknowledging the endurance of his work and the way that Moby-Dick in particular has inspired so many other works of literature, art. I think that every generation has its own need for and response to Moby-Dick. And I look forward to hearing Nathaniel Philbrick's talk shortly on what the novel might mean to us and offer to us today. I propose to pause a little over halfway between 1851, when the book was published, and today, in order to think about what Moby-Dick meant to one of its greatest interpreters, the artist Rockwell Kent, in the early 20th century. Among many other feats in a very prolific life, Rockwell Kent illustrated the 1930 Lakeside and Random House editions of Moby-Dick, beloved by so many of us. And I should say that I'm grateful to the librarians in the research library and to Dan Elias for pulling out the 1930 editions of Moby-Dick that I'll be discussing today, and they're on exhibition in the library. If you have a moment and you haven't seen them before, please go take a look. They're unbelievably special. So today I'm going to tell you some stories from Rockwell Kent's life, and I'm going to talk about how the 1930 Lakeside Press of Moby-Dick got made, including a deep dive into Rockwell Kent's technique. I'll end by reflecting on what Kent's work says about Moby-Dick and what it says to us today. So the whaling world of Moby-Dick in the 19th century was a wooden world. Our everyday world in the 21st century is arguably a world of plastic and maybe silicon, you know. Rockwell Kent's illustrations, I think, help us understand how we got from there to here and what the old-fashioned wooden world might still mean to us today. So Rockwell Kent was born in 1882 and spent a privileged and, by accounts, fairly happy childhood, growing up in his family homes in Tarrytown, New York, and on Long Island. He graduated from Horace Mann in New York City in 1900, and he enrolled in Columbia University in order to study architecture. He was apparently a pretty bad student. He was much more interested in extracurricular activities and in off-campus art lessons with artists like William Merritt Chase and Robert Henry, and who can blame him? In 1902, he dropped out of Columbia, and he went to study art full-time. During this period, he got very involved in socialist politics in New York, and he befriended famous socialists like Mother Jones and W.E.B. Du Bois. So Kent had a complicated relationship with New York City. Any New Yorkers here in the audience today? Yeah, a handful. So Kent had a complicated relationship with the city. He spent long times in the city trying to escape it and get out of it into a more adventurous life in the wilderness. Kent called New York City the Gold Camp. To Kent, New York was a place to go, earn as much money as possible, and get out of town as quickly as possible. Shortly after dropping out of Columbia, Kent moved to Monhegan Island in Maine for a few years and took several adventurous voyages from there to other places in the world. In 1918 and 1919, he took his little small son, who I think was maybe 9 years old, something like that, to a remote island in Alaska where he wintered over. He also took adventurous sailing voyages to Tierra del Fuego and Greenland. Throughout this adventurous period, Kent made and exhibited several paintings, and he also produced a huge number of woodcuts, lithographs, and drawings for commercial clients. This is the Gold Camp. He was a prolific book illustrator and an in-demand advertising artist for a wide variety of commercial campaigns. Some of his designs you'll still recognize today, designs for Random House books. He designed that logo, Viking. There's some many sort of famous book colophons that you'll recognize from his work. Later in life, Kent continued to produce art and writing at a blistering pace. He wrote 2 long memoirs, and he continued staying active in politics. In 1953, he was brought before Joseph McCarthy's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations in order to discuss his relationship with the Communist Party. What I love is that Kent, during his testimony, stood up and accused Joseph McCarthy of starting a conspiracy against the welfare of the United States. Kent was complicated. He was a patriot of the United States and also an ardent socialist and communist. He sustained a long relationship with the Soviet Union, and he traveled to the USSR, and in 1967, he won the Lenin Peace Prize. A lot of his works, which I haven't had the chance to take a look at yet, are actually held at the Hermitage in Russia. So he was married 3 times. He had a very interesting personal life, and he was the father of several children. He died in 1971 at the end of a fascinating and busy life, and I doubt that he ever slept. Rockwell Kent's famous illustrations for Moby-Dick were commissioned by Lakeside Press, a fine books publishing imprint of the powerful Chicago printing house called R.R. Donnelley. R.R. Donnelley, for the most part, published cheap ephemeral documents like catalogs, and remember, Chicago is the home of Sears and the home of kind of catalog shopping, and R.R. Donnelley was the publishing house that put out all of these voluminous catalogs. But Lakeside Press was R.R. Donnelley's bid to enter the fine book publishing process and to start getting contracts from some of the New York book publishers. Lakeside Press initiated what they called the 4 American Books campaign in the early 20th century, in which they would produce these 4 beautiful American 19th century classics, distribute them in the hopes of attracting new clients. The 4 books in the series were Moby-Dick, Edgar Allan Poe's Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, Richard Henry Dana's 2 Years Before the Mast, and Henry David Thoreau's Walden. Lakeside Press intended for the 4 American Books campaign to show what fine book printing in America could be and set a new standard. William Kittredge was the head of Lakeside Press, who initiated the 4 American Books campaign in 1926, and he invited Rockwell Kent's participation. Kittredge had initially asked Kent to illustrate Dana's 2 Years Before the Mast, but Kent lobbied to illustrate Moby-Dick instead. In the 4 years that lapsed between Kent's first contact with Kittredge and the publication of the book, the project grew enormously in size and scale. At first, MobyDick was supposed to be published in one volume with a modest number of illustrations. But Kent worked so prolifically and with so much support from Kittredge that he eventually created more than 300 illustrations for a book that needed to be printed in 3 volumes. Working closely with Kittredge and the designers at Lakeside Press, Kent consulted on all elements of the book design. He and Kittredge even mailed paper samples back and forth to each other in order that Kent could approve the paper that would best hold and display his illustrations alongside the type. And Kent designed the aluminum slipcover that comes with the 3-volume edition of Moby-Dick. Kittredge was a little skeptical. He called it, quote, stunty, but Kent thought that it was a kind of nice modern contrast to the illustrations inside. That aluminum slipcover, if you see it in antiquarian booksellers, you'll see that some people call it the in the pale. So Kent threw himself into research for the volume. He read, researched, and talked with Robert Cushman Murphy, maybe a familiar name to some of you. Murphy was the associate curator of ornithology at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. In 1912, Murphy himself voyaged on the whaler called Daisy to the Antarctic whaling grounds, where he was on assignment from the American Natural History Museum to observe and collect Antarctic bird specimens. But in addition to performing his naturalist work, Murphy also apprehended the historical significance of this late-stage US whaling voyage that he participated in, and he published a quite wonderful account of the voyage called Logbook for Grace. The Archives of American Art in Washington, D.C. Hold a lot of photographs that Robert Cushman Murphy gave to Kent to help him get inspired for the edition. And we can see just how closely Kent copied Murphy's photographs. There's a scale model here of a humpback whale, which would inform some of the models in the museum at the American Museum of Natural History. And we see a kind of whale alongside the ship awaiting cutting in the above illustration. And I think it goes to show just how hard Kent worked at making his work sort of documentarily truthful, but also beautiful. Kent himself had a lifelong personal interest in whaling print culture as well. This photograph shows the living room in Kent's upstate New York house, which is wallpapered with old navigational charts and maps. Like me, Kent is in the inland dreaming of the ocean. So hanging in the wall above the piano is this whaling print by English printmaker W.J. Huggins. And this image of a whale turned upside down in attack, we heard something about this pose in the readings this morning from the logbooks and from Moby-Dick. This pose reappears several times throughout Kent's illustrations from Moby-Dick. So Kittredge, Kent's man at Lakeside Press, was thrilled. And even though Kent must have been a very difficult collaborator, Kittredge egged him on at every step. During the time that Kent was on assignment for Lakeside Press, he was traveling constantly. He missed every single deadline he had. He filed some of his late illustrations by post from Greenland after he shipwrecked his boat, but he kept making illustrations. But Kittredge was a steady and encouraging force. In 1929, he wrote to Kent after receiving a package of the illustrations. "The drawings which came in this morning are," all capital letters, "wonderful. We will all go jump in a lake if this book is not the greatest illustrated book ever done in America." And Kent himself wrote in his memoir about how nice it was to work with Kittredge, no wonder. He says, "I tell you, when you're shown such great respect, you do good work." The reading public met Rockwell Kent's work with similar enthusiasm. The book got rave reviews and big sales. The 3-volume Lakeside Press edition was only printed in 1,000 copies, but Lakeside Press contracted with Random House to print the Rockwell Kent illustrated edition on a smaller scale, a pocket edition, that would be produced and sold en masse. The Random House pocket edition became a bestseller, in no part on the basis of, not because of the basis of Rockwell Kent's very famous reputation. It was, in fact, Rockwell Kent whose name was on the cover of the book, on the spine. We don't even see Herman Melville on here. Robert Frost noted this, not even an error, noticed this fact in a kind of obscure verse play that he wrote in 1947, a dialogue between a shopper and a shopkeeper. The shopper says, there's a story you may have forgotten about a whale. The shopkeeper says, oh, you mean Moby-Dick by Rockwell Kent that everyone's talking about. I think that Frost's lines sort of reflect somewhat bitterly on the vagaries of literary fame, but at the same time, I think it also helps us understand just how powerfully famous Rockwell Kent was and what Kent did to advance Melville's reputation in the time. So Kent's illustrations, I'm finally going to show you some of these beautiful illustrations. They're at once intimate and epic. He captures the loving relationship between Queequeg and Ishmael as they lay together in bed at the Spouter Inn in New Bedford. And he renders the experience of sailing and whaling with great empathy for the workers. His images of whales are iconic, and they capture the mystery and power of Melville's eponymous protagonist, Moby-Dick. One of Kent's most frightening pictures of the whale, and one which I think helps us understand the power of Kent's illustrations, appears in chapter 99 of the Doubloon. This image terrifies us by putting its human subjects in miniature perspective. These tiny whalemen are raising their harpoons and lances, it looks like, but the show of force is hopeless in the face of the monstrous beast below. The whale itself is rendered pretty minimally here. At first I had a hard time even reading the image because it's hard to see exactly the perspective at which we're looking at the whale, but that loop of dots in the bottom of the page is actually the hairpin curve of the sperm whale's bottom jaw. And the sperm whale is swimming toward us directly with its jaw open. And I think that the power of Kent's illustrations to engulf us in the story and even into the pictorial space of the readings are some of their enduring attractions. And to return to the theme that I started my talk with today, Rockwell Kent's famous illustrations cast Herman Melville's novel into a world made of wood. Consider Kent's full-page portrait of Captain Ahab, who enlists the crew of his whaling ship to pursue vengeance on the sperm whale who took off his leg. In Kent's portrait, Ahab stands on the wooden deck of his whaling ship and gazes out to sea as if to call forth his enemy. Everything in the ship is made out of long lines running close to each other like the grain of wood. The illustration delineates individual wooden slats in the deck on the side railing, and then you can even see two small curls that suggest the circular head of a bolt or nail and evoke the carpentry that made the ship. Kent was a craftsman who would have paid attention to this. Ahab's watch coat is composed of heavy horizontal lines that run parallel to the lines of the wooden ship that he stands on. His coat is fastened like the wooden railing behind him, drawn together by four circular buttons that echo the bolt heads. This sea horizon is constituted by lines stacked so tightly that the ocean appears almost black. Not even the clouds in Kent's linear illustrations are permitted to be soft or cottony. They are given dimension through rigid dots and dashes. And Ahab's stern face appears carved in wood too, the angry and sorrowful lines in his face engraved as deeply as his hollowed out eyes and downturned mouth. Ahab's ivory prosthesis is edged in fine-toothed shadows, the only unlined object in the scene. So Ahab's portrait, like each of Kent's illustrations from Moby-Dick, appears to be a wood engraving, and the match between the subject and the medium could hardly be better suited. The lines, textures, and formal echoes in Kent's portrait of Captain Ahab all point to the wooden block upon which an engraver would have cut the stylized image in reverse. Ahab even appears to be a kind of engraver's avatar, the sharp point of his ivory leg standing on the wooden deck like an engraver's burin on a wooden block. Wood, strong and rigid, is symbolic of Ahab's obsession with the white whale. And wood made up the infrastructure of the 19th century whaling industry, from the wooden ships to the wooden harpoons, from the wood that fed the blubber-rendering fires to the wooden casks filled with whale oil. In 1930, when Kent's illustrations were published, Moby-Dick's wooden world was history. Kent's illustrations, which evoked wood in so many different ways, also evoked nostalgia for that past, or at least passing, wooden world. And indeed, Kent was an accomplished woodcutter who well understood the practice of wood engraving and the formal characteristics of woodcut engravings and woodcuts. Kent created woodcuts and engravings throughout his career, and he even wrote a little pamphlet that described the process and kind of extolled the virtues of the medium. Kent was truly famous for these woodcuts, which were used in advertising campaigns for everything from jewelry to yachts to books. He designed some of those famous colophons that I mentioned before in the woodcut style. And I think that while Kent created the visual language that would sort of evoke classic style for a lot of his advertisers, he was also branding himself with the same style. You can always recognize kind of Rockwell Kent woodcut print because of the way that you see those lines. But the surprising thing about Rockwell Kent's illustrations for Moby-Dick is that they are not woodcuts or wood engravings. They're ink drawings that Kent made using a brush and ink and sent off to be converted through a number of photochemical processes and other mediations into line cuts, which were eventually used to produce the illustrations that we see in the book. No wood was carved, no wood was harmed in the production of Kent's Moby-Dick. Kent did indeed produce a large body of actual wood engravings, but most of the woodcut style illustrations he created for Moby-Dick were executed in pen and ink, a soft brush and the liquid ink. There was nothing malicious in this. Kent wasn't trying to pass off his drawings as woodcut prints. He wasn't trying to say they're something that they weren't. But a lot of people assumed that they were because of Kent's prolific production as a woodcut illustrator. And you often see today, even in catalogs and curatorial notes, people will misidentify these sort of soft, delicate brush drawings as engravings. And it's easy to understand why. I mean, look at them. They look like they're carved from wood. So you might be tempted to say, it doesn't really matter what he originally made his original work in, because in the world of modern printing, so many processes have to happen to an image to get it into a mass-marketed book for a consumer. Who cares? But I continue to be fascinated by this choice that Rockwell Kent made to fake the woodblock style in his most famous work. On the one hand, it's easy to understand the logistical constraints that made drawings easier than woodblock carvings. Woodblock carvings required raw material, tools, a studio, a stationary lifestyle. That would never happen for Kent, and time. Kent, meanwhile, was constantly on the move. He was on the high seas quite literally when he was making these illustrations. And that brush and ink were a lot more portable than a kind of woodblock carving setup. But in the end of the day, given that, why would you try to make those ink drawings look like woodcuts? Why not exploit the beauty of that beautiful liquid, inky brush and ink technique? Why did wood mean so much to Kent and his sort of consumers and audiences that he would go to so much work to fake it? Faking a woodcut print sounds hard. I haven't tried it. So there's a name for these objects created in one style that are meant to evoke another earlier style. That name is skeuomorph. Hang with me. Kent's woodblock print simulations for Moby-Dick are skeuomorphs. They are artifacts with design features that resemble the essential characteristics of another medium in another, typically earlier, technological process. I realize I may be taxing your patience on a beautiful August morning with obscure Greek words, but I think skeuomorph is worth it. A skeuomorph is a nostalgic type of remediation. Typically, the medium to which a skeuomorph refers that it fakes is an earlier, an obsolete, or an old medium, a kind of decorative vestige that cites past techniques and technologies. So let me offer you an example of a skeuomorph that you probably have in your pocket. So here's my phone, and I want you to be very, very, very quiet as I take your picture. Okay, everyone smile. Now listen very, very closely. Do you hear that? That click?
Yes.
That's the sound of a shutter, but this thing doesn't have a shutter in it. The shutter is kind of a tool to tell us, oh, listen, you're taking a picture. Digital photography is quiet. It is very, very quiet. But that shutter is kind of like an instructional tool. It's Apple saying to us, you're taking a photograph. This is how it works. You know because of the sound of the shutter. But how many of us walk around today with a camera that actually has a shutter? Maybe some of us, but not a lot of us. And I think that the digital world is so full of skeuomorphism like this, and it seems almost natural. Think about the photographs that you might take and alter in Instagram, how they confer a kind of Kodachrome warmth or sepia tones to cold digital images. Films and television shows shot on digital cameras are edited in post-production so that images look scratched, grainy, and otherwise shot through with the imperfections of analog film. And here in the 21st century, your computers and smartphones offer a rich archive of skeuomorphism. Steve Jobs and Apple designers deliberately deployed skeuomorphism as a corporate strategy, this was in their design notes, to bring consumers into closer relationship with Apple products. Digital files are stored in digital folders and are disposed of in recycle bins. You know? There's not a recycle bin in here. You know, these are all represented in digital space by their counterparts in the analog material world of the typical office, which Apple, frankly, is trying to replace and forever change. So skeuomorphism offers a sense of continuity between new and old media, and it teaches us how to navigate a new world. Skeuomorphs ease us users into the future with the familiar shapes of the past. Apple began moving away from skeuomorphism, again, there was a memo, around 2013 under the direction of Apple Chief Design Officer Jonathan Ive, who has tried to design skeuomorphism out of recent editions of Apple's operating system in favor of what he calls flat design based on the principles of modernism. But Apple has recently returned to skeuomorphic design with Apple Watches, which display the image of an analog watch face. And I think it's poignant that Apple has returned to skeuomorphism with watches, because skeuomorphic nostalgia is inherently about the loss of a worker's authority over his time. Think about Rockwell Kent's day. In his day and in our own, skeuomorphs register our anxiety about the way that work can engulf other parts of our life, anxiety, in short, about how we do our work and how we spend our time. I do not know what Rockwell Kent believed or intended for his work, but I believe that in the cultural imagination of at least certain East Coast city dwellers for whom working meant manipulating machines or sitting at a desk, the woodcut style evoked the memory and fantasy of another kind of work, hard manual labor that brought workers into close relationship with the land. The new patterns of tourism that was emerging on the East Coast in the late 19th and 20th centuries fulfilled a similar desire. This new form of tourism saw well-heeled city tourists vacationing in rustic cottages while hunting, fishing, canoeing, sailing, and swimming. Kent understood the kind of desire of this type of work. Again, he oscillated between desk work in the gold camp and adventurous voyages to the world's most cold, forbidding, and remote coastlines, places like Newfoundland, Greenland, Alaska, Tierra del Fuego, and even closer to home in Maine. Kent was drawn to Maine. Maine was kind of Kent's like Nantucket. So Kent was not alone in his idealization of Maine and the maritime world. Teachers and colleagues of his from the Ashcan School and the Stieglitz Circle, like Robert Henry, George Bellows, especially Marsden Hartley, these people all kind of aligned themselves with the space and went there to create art. As the art historian Donna Cassidy has argued, the idea of Maine among tourists and modernist artists alike lay at the intersection of two fantasies. The first of New England, an archetypal American region with a strong connection to the past, and the second of Maine residents as North Atlantic folk who were hardy, anti-modern, hardworking, and rugged individuals. Kent was introduced to Maine by his teacher, Robert Henry, and Kent's Maine was tiny Monhegan Island. Who here has been to Monhegan? It's a beautiful place. It's located near Boothbay Harbor, about 12 miles off the coast. Kent wrote that he discovered, quote, real work for the first time on the island, and he lived there on and off from about 1905 to 1910. Then, as now, it was home to a small year-round population, mostly of fishermen, and an enclave of artists who went every summer to paint the lighthouse, sea views, and rocky headlands. While there, Kent consolidated the vibrant, realistic style that would define his work across multiple media. This was also the place, according to Kent's memoir in 1955, the memoir is called It's Me, O Lord, where his encounters with fishermen and other laborers first awakened his class consciousness. This would have been poignant for a socialist like Kent. He described watching the fishermen from a cliff and experiencing a wave of shame at his own literally and figuratively elevated position of observation. He said this, and this is sort of characteristic of Kent's exclamatory style. Everything was big. God, how I envied them their power to row, to pull their heavy traps. I'd see my own thin wrists, my artist's hands, as though for the first time I saw my work in true perspective and felt its triviality. It is easier to do a job of work, said Oscar Wilde, I think he said to dig a ditch, than to write about it. What rot! Why, Oscar never worked a day in his life. With these thoughts, this envy agitating me, these social and political convictions which had hitherto existed as figments of my mind and heart began to acquire substance. Not just from Whitehead, but from Empyrean heights had I looked down on life, down at the masses, and not up with them. What would I do, I thought, should working men not work for me? The answer shamed me. So Kent tried to make himself into one of these tough Monhegan laborers, and during those 5 years he worked as a well driller, a lobsterman, a longshoreman, and a house builder. And you got the feel for Kent's admiration for the fishermen in his 1907 painting made during those Monhegan years called Toilers of the Sea. This beautiful painting shows fishermen hauling lobster traps in two small dories, pitching precariously on rough seas near the spot on Monhegan Island that Kent described above. Although Kent modeled himself on Monhegan's working fishermen, he himself shared more than he liked to admit with the wealthy leisure class. Kent's experience of Maine was made possible by the modern tourist industry. The paradox of Maine's privileged place in the work of modernists like Hartley, Kent, and others is that Maine was only accessible because of the development of a highly modern tourist infrastructure, a network of highways, gas stations, motels, restaurants that was rapidly converting the land of authentic labor into hyper-modern vacation land, a slogan which first appeared, by the way, on Maine license plates in 1936. And this is the paradox of New England coastal tourism that I think still resonates with us today. In order to get to this beautiful island to see you all today, yesterday I took 2 planes, rented a car at Logan, drove to Hyannis, caught a gas-powered ferry, came here. And while I'm here, what I really hope to do is see some wooden boats, eat some fresh seafood, turn off the iPhone, I hope to have this experience, but this was all made possible by a lot of non-quaint technology and infrastructure that got me here. Okay, so what does this all have to do with Herman Melville and Moby-Dick, the reason for our conversation today? So to begin with, I think that Rockwell Kent's nostalgia for the unmechanized, authentic wooden world of the 19th century picks up a fascinating thread in Melville's own novel. Melville went whaling in the 1840s and he published Moby-Dick in the 1850s, at the very cusp of an energy transition that would change the world. Whaling belonged to the energy economy of the 19th century. The whaling industry was vital as a major source of oil for lighting and machine lubrication. As soon as large reserves of petroleum were discovered and tapped in Pennsylvania in 1859, the market for whale oil crashed and began to decline. Whaling belonged to the old energy regime predicated on organic sources like whale oil and tallow and wind. In the mid-19th century, coal production ramped up and petroleum flooded the market, and the fossil fuel age began. Herman Melville did not look into the future and see this world coming. I don't believe he was a clairvoyant, but I do believe that he saw the technological change was happening all around him. And I think he wrote Moby-Dick with the understanding that whaling itself might not last forever. I think that the narrator of his novel, Ishmael, is something like a proto-hipster or a proto-tourist who went whaling as much for the romance and sights as anything else. This is Ishmael. Ishmael in 1851 was a whole lot like Rockwell Kent in 1930. Like Kent, Ishmael fled the gold camp of New York. Ishmael's narrative begins in New York, as you might remember, quote, your insular city of the Manhattoes, where he announces his intention to go whaling. But he immediately leaves the city. At the beginning of his narrative, Ishmael feels grim and morbid, and he goes whaling in order to restore his vitality, a complaint and a hope for a cure that Kent himself reiterated at the start of nearly every of his travel narratives. For both Kent and Ishmael, it was important that they reenacted the voyages of the past. Moby-Dick was published in 1851 at the height of the whaling industry's productivity and prosperity in New Bedford. But Ishmael ships out of Nantucket, a whaling port long surpassed by New Bedford. And sort of Ishmael kind of gives his reasons for this. Besides, though New Bedford has of late been gradually monopolizing the business of whaling, and though in this matter poor old Nantucket is now much behind her, yet Nantucket was her great original, the Tyre of this Carthage. And when Ishmael leaves Nantucket, he ships out on the Pequod, a 50-year-old ship that he chooses specifically for its romantic antiquarianism. She was a ship of the old school, rather small, if anything, with an old-fashioned, claw-footed look about her. Kent preferred old boats too. He forewent modern motor yachts in favor of wooden sailing vessels for some of his own adventures. And I think Kent's skeuomorphic woodblock style drawings also reveal his preference for illustrations of the old school. But there are important differences between Kent's nostalgia and Ishmael's. Ishmael's nostalgia is weird, it's premature, it's out of time. Whaling isn't obsolete yet, the wooden world isn't romantic yet, but Ishmael's prematurely nostalgic. And Ishmael, I think is important to say, is not a stand-in for Herman Melville. As you know, Mary Kay Burkott Edwards just told us that when Melville went whaling, he shipped out of New Bedford on the brand new state-of-the-art whaling vessel, the Acushnet. When Ishmael passes through New Bedford, a city Melville himself knew well, he's awed by the city's whaling wealth. He writes, "Nowhere in America will you find more patrician-like houses." Ishmael, though, makes a concerted effort to get out of New Bedford, and he spends dear money, in fact, Queequeg's money, to ship out of Nantucket instead. And Nantucket at the time was a sandy island populated by a small, strange community of old-fashioned Quakers. So Ishmael, they might have been meeting right here. So Ishmael chooses Nantucket because it is a place out of time, a place where Ishmael can imagine the possibilities of the post-industrial future. In Nantucket, Ishmael foresees the demise of the whaling industry from within the heights of its productivity. He does not believe in endless economic growth and growing prosperity, and he goes to Nantucket, at least in part, as I see it, to confront the decline that is coming. In 1851, Moby-Dick anticipates the obsolescence of American whaling. Ishmael sees beyond the whaling boom to the end of the industry. He sees Nantucket and New Bedford and the thriving whaling industry itself as transient episodes in a panorama of rising and always falling industries and fortunes. Melville's Moby-Dick offers itself up as a skeuomorph for the future, creating a language of quaintness to warn future generations to heed the necessary changes that will come in their own time, in our own time. Kent's woodblock-style illustrations accept that invitation to nostalgia that is inherent in Moby-Dick. Kent evoked his fantasy of artisanal labor in the style of his illustrations, but the skeuomorphic drawings, made without a woodblock, acknowledge and even abet the decline of woodblock production itself, an admission that obsolescence is built in. Herman Melville lived at the cusp of a major technological transition at the beginning of the fossil fuel age. Think too about the way that the world changed during Rockwell Kent's lifetime between 1882 and 1971. He lived to see the widespread adoption of film, radio, television, automobiles, and planes. He even died after the progenitors to the internet were being invented. He shipwrecked a wooden sailboat in Greenland in his youth, and he lived to see the moon landing. The wonderful skeuomorphic drawings that Kent made for Moby-Dick reflect some of the needs and desires of a world in transition. And they issue a challenge to us today as we face the crises of political division and climate change. How can Moby-Dick help us navigate our own world in transition? Thank you.